Good evening, Ricky. We are in Mark chapter 15 tonight. Now, where we left off last week, we actually went through Peter's denial, but I'd like to take us back just a little bit to talk about, we're going to go back to Mark 14, verse 60, and that's the start of Jesus' trials. And you'll remember there's 6 trials that Jesus goes through. First 3 that were Jewish, and then there was 3 that were Gentile. And so let's start with the Jewish. Mark 14, verse 60. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Don't you have any answer to what these men are testifying against you?" But he kept silent and didn't answer at all. The high priest asked him again, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any witnesses?" He asked. "You have heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict?" And all of them condemned him as deserving death. Now here's the problem, though. They don't have the ability to enact capital punishment or death. Okay, that's beyond their ability. In 6 to 7 AD, Augustus Caesar placed Coponius as a Roman procurator. I'll get it. Yeah, I'll get the words out, I promise. He made Coponius over the region. And when he did that, Coponius said, "Enough with the Sanhedrin ruling over capital cases." And they said, "You can't preside over death penalty cases anymore." Now, what the Babylonian Talmud tells us, and this is a quote, and I have it up here for you. "When the members of the Sanhedrin found themselves deprived of their right over life and death, they covered their heads with ashes and with their bodies with sackcloth and bemoaned, 'Woe unto us, for the scepter has departed from Judah, and the Messiah has not come.'" The Sanhedrin literally believed that the Bible, the Torah, was broken, that God did not come through in his promise. And the reason they believed that was because Jacob, on his deathbed, was blessing his sons in Genesis 49, and he gave a promise to Judah, and this is what he said in verse 10, chapter 49, verse 10 of Genesis. "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh," or the Messiah, "comes. And to him shall be the obedience of the people." So they literally went around thinking that the Bible was broken. If they would have only known, in Nazareth, there was a little boy growing up in a carpenter's shop who will one day rule the world and all of the nations with a rod of iron. They didn't realize it, and they thought that the Messiah didn't come, the scepter, now we can't rule over our own people, we're done for. Josephus, in fact, he was a Jewish Roman historian during the current time of Jesus. He made a mention that the Sanhedrin were assembled to pronounce James to be killed. You remember James being killed. It was in the book of Acts. It was a big deal. It was very sad. Well, Josephus mentions that this is them combining the Sanhedrin to kill James was a good part of the reason why Rome destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, because they came together really quickly and they said that James and several others were going to be stoned. And when they said that, it wasn't under Roman authority, and Rome considered it a slap in the face or direct disobedience. And then a few years, that was part of it, and then a few years later they came and they just wiped them all out. So the reason I bring all this little bit of history in here is because the trial could not end with the Jews. It also had to end with the Gentiles to fulfill prophecy. It had to be for the whole world. But because of this obscure law from 6 and 7 AD, and Augustus Caesar and Coponius, Now we want him dead, but now they have to take him to the Gentiles to do it. And so that's where we're going to find ourselves now in Mark chapter 15. As soon as it was morning, Jesus has been in trial all night long. As soon as it was morning, the high priest convened a meeting with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. Everybody came together. They bound Jesus with chains, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "You say so." In other words, you said it, buddy. Now, what's interesting is the Greek gives us an emphasis on the word you. So literally, Pilate would have said it like this: "Are you the king of the Jews?" You got to be kidding. Pilate had seen kings. He'd seen Caesars. He'd seen people getting toppled by Rome. And Jesus didn't look anything like a king. He was shocked. Verse 3, the high priest kept accusing Jesus of many things. So Pilate asked him again, "Don't you have any answer? Look how many accusations they're bringing against you." But since Jesus no longer answered, Pilate was astonished. He couldn't believe it. What benefit was it for Jesus to say nothing? How did it benefit him at all? Why didn't he back up and just say, "Listen, these are all lies"? Well, for one, Isaiah 53 verse 7 promised that Jesus was going to go as a sheep before his shearers silent. So it was prophesied. But if it would have been a benefit, why didn't God just say, "Okay, Isaiah, I want you to leave that out. I'm not going to tell that to you, so don't write it down"? And Jesus could have said something in his defense. Why did he stay silent? Well, part of the reason, I think, was Jesus had no one to stand up with him. First of all, he didn't speak. But everyone that could have spoken of the validity of Jesus and the lies that were being told about him, they'd all scattered. Jesus was standing alone without a lawyer for him. And I think part of the reason that Jesus didn't speak was so that he could endure all. And he could feel all when injustice is taking place and there's no one to speak for the truth. If Jesus would have spoken up, we know from all of our past experience going through the Gospels that Jesus would have won the argument. He never lost a single one. In fact, every time he went into an argument or a debate with the Pharisees, anybody else, they left confused about what they believed. He won every time. If he would have spoken up, he would have won the argument. He might not have been put to death. But further than that, I really believe he stood alone here so that in the future, he can stand by us. He can endure because he knows what it's like. He could stand alone before men so that we could stand united and he be our advocate before God the Father. And so he opened not his mouth. He did not defend himself. 1 John chapter 2 verse 1 says, "My little children, these things I write to you so that you may not sin. And if anyone does sin, we have an advocate, a lawyer with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous." He stood alone, so he knows what it's like when you do. And he won't let that happen on Judgment Day. He's going to stand beside you. Verse 6. I am keeping up with it. At every festival, Pilate would release any one prisoner whom the people requested. Now there was a man in prison named Barabbas. He had been with the insurgents who had committed murder during the rebellion. So the crowd came and began to request Pilate do for them what he always did. Pilate answered them, "Do you want me to release the king of the Jews for you?" Because he knew that the high priest had handed Jesus over due to jealousy. Pilate's no fool. He's a politician. He knows what's going on. They're not fooling him. So he, as a trade, I was going to give you Barabbas, but he's a murderer. This guy hasn't done anybody any harm. He may sound a little crazy, but he hasn't hurt anybody. Why don't I give you him instead? From the other Gospels, we find out that Pilate did everything in his power to let Jesus go, with the exception of his final decision to follow after the people, and we'll talk about that in a second. He tried over and over again, and this is one of the times. This trade would have been a good one. He thought, man, this is an easy trade. I know what they'll pick. But he didn't. We often have the idea that the crowd that's saying we want Barabbas, not Jesus, we often look at them and we just question, how could these people who came and cheered Jesus on, coming in on Palm Sunday, how could they turn around so quickly and decry him and ask for his execution? Well, there's another possibility to this, and as I studied, I find it pretty interesting and pretty compelling. Barabbas, we think of Barabbas as the bad guy, mainly because we know the end of the story, that he gets traded, he's the murderer, he's the bad guy, he's the insurrectionist. For the Romans, yeah, that's a bad guy. That was the one thing you didn't do for Rome. You did not become an insurrectionist. As long as you kept the peace, everybody's happy. We don't care what you do, just don't create a war. That's what Barabbas was trying to do. Barabbas was a bad guy. For the Jews, though, who wanted to overthrow Rome, Barabbas was a hero. And if there were any people that were here at 6 o'clock in the morning, at sunrise, for Jesus' trial, they had to be a plant. You think about it. Jesus was taken away in the middle of the night in the Garden of Gethsemane. Off all by themselves. The troops come in and they seize Jesus without a huge ruckus, so it's all in quiet. Then they take Jesus all night long and have him in trials. They do not have Jesus in trial where it should have been, out in the open. No, they have it at Caiaphas' house. They have it in secret, so nobody knows that it's going on. The next morning at sunrise, when they bring him to Pilate, the only people that could have known that Jesus was even under trial were the local disciples that had seen it, or anybody that had been planted there. And all it took was just a little chiding by the religious leaders, and the group of people were all fit to say, give us Barabbas, our hero. This was not so much the people turning against Jesus. In fact, there's one commentator, I think he said, it could have been as little as 15 people that were instrumental in getting Jesus crucified. This was politics. Verse 11. But the high priests stirred up the crowd to get them to release Barabbas for them instead. So Pilate asked them again, then what should I do with this man you call King of the Jews? Crucify him, they shouted. Why? Pilate asked. What has he done wrong? But they shouted even louder, crucify him. What a question. What should I do with this Jesus, King of the Jews? The church historian Origen, he was around 200 AD. He tells us that Barabbas' name was actually Jesus Barabbas. Jesus was a relatively common name, much like mine. And what he says is, in Hebrew, which we do know this, bar means son. That's the word for son. And what does Abbas mean? Father. Origen tells us that Judas Barabbas was Judas, son of a father. And so Pilate is literally giving the people the choice. Do you want Jesus, son of a father, a human, or do you want Jesus, son of the Father, whose origins were not human? He thought it would be an easy choice for them, and they chose son of a father. Like most, they looked for their hero to be somebody like them. It didn't matter how hard Pilate tried to get them to change their voice. It didn't matter what he did to get out of having to make a choice, sending Jesus to Herod and back, which isn't in our text here, but it's in our other Gospels. He did everything he could not to have to make this choice between Jesus, son of a Father, and Jesus, son of the Father. But ultimately, he had to make one. And he made the wrong one. You and I, we have to make the same decision. Is your hero going to be somebody that's born in this earth? Or is your hero going to be someone that wasn't born? Or at least his origins were not of this earth? We have the same choice that Pilate had to make. We all make it individually. If he'll be our Savior or Barabbas, the insurrectionist, the murderer, the one that comes to steal, kill, and destroy. But there's an odd twist of irony here. Because Pilate asks, well, what should I do with this Jesus, King of the Jews? What am I supposed to do with him? Like Pilate had choice over Jesus' destiny. But in truth, the choice that Pilate made wasn't determining Jesus' destiny. It was determining his. And it's the same thing for us. If we choose to accept Jesus or not as our Savior, it does not change his character, who he is, or how he's going to react. It won't change it. But it will change us. It will change us. Verse 15. So Pilate, wanting to satisfy the crowd, what a terrible statement, released Barabbas for them. But he had Jesus whipped and handed him over to be crucified. Just because the voices are louder doesn't mean that they're right. And man, in our United States right now, we need to hold on to that fact. Just because they're loud doesn't mean they're right. And honestly, just because they're the majority doesn't mean they're right. And just because it's a law doesn't mean it's morally right. The word whipped here, I'm using the International Standard Version. I love the writers of it and the commentators that go with it. But their wording here when it says that Jesus was whipped does not give justice to what Jesus endured. The word here that they have in the King James and the New King James is scourged. The idea was that they tied a person bent over a post so that his back is exposed. And they would have one on one shoulder and one on the other, and they would take turns whipping as they could with a cat of nine tails. A short, foot-long stick that had strips of leather on it that had bone and glass and lead. And the idea was that when you hit the person, it was made to come in, set, and then rip the flesh and meat loose. And it's kind of like when you're going fishing and you set the hook when a fish comes on. And that's what they would do. They would whip it and then they would pull to get as much flesh loose as they could. If done properly, you would be able to see the lungs, the intestines, the inner workings of the body. You'd be able to see it graphically. And that's what they were doing to Jesus. One commentator said that when they would do this, the Romans used it as a truth serum. And they would have someone, as they're whipping them, in between blows, there would be a person with a writing tablet. And if you told them the crimes that you had committed, the next blow would not be as hard. If you didn't say anything, then they made it harder. It was their idea of the third degree. What it did, it worked great for the local police, because then if, someone was robbed way over here, if the person confessed to it, well, then they don't have to search anymore. Well, that case was solved. That was easy. And the idea was, it's that old phrase, if you torture a person enough, they'll confess to anything. And that's what they would do. And by the end of it, they would have confessed to all kinds of crimes that they never committed, but now the Romans didn't have to go figure out who did it. Of course, Jesus, though, being silent as a sheep before his shearers, had nothing to confess. And so his punishment only got worse and worse. Verse 16, the soldiers led Jesus into the courtyard of the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and called out to the whole guard. They dressed him up in a purple robe, twisted some thorns into a victor's crown, and they placed it on his head. They began to greet him, "Long live King of the Jews!" They kept hitting him on the head with a stick, spitting on him, kneeling in front of him and worshiping him. When they had finished making fun of him, they stripped him of the purple robe, put his own clothes back on him, and led him away to be crucified. Now that Jesus is condemned to death, no holds barred, anything goes. Whatever you want to do to a condemned prisoner is fine. And so they hand Jesus over to the Roman guard of 600. Now what they don't tell here, but other passages tell, they put a bag or a cloak over Jesus' head. And what they would do is, it was called hot hand, and it was a game. And they would come by and they would strike you. Well, if you see a blow coming, you can prepare for it. But if you don't, you take it, the full brunt of it, and you take much more damage. Well, what they would do is one by one, they would go through and they would hit you. And then there would be one person in the group that did not hit you. They would take the blindfold off and have you guess. If you didn't guess, went through it again. If you guessed wrong, they went through it again. And of course, they're not all truthful, so they got to do it all over again. And they did this over and over again to Jesus. Putting the robe on him was not convenient either. With you bleeding profusely, you know what happens when you put a shirt on or something. It coagulates, it collects on that skin and holds kind of like duct tape to hair on your leg. And so when they ripped it off of his body, they ripped it profusely to be bleeding again. This was horrific. The scourging was bad enough. But now they take a crown of thorns and they place it on his head. They take a reed and they beat it down deep into his skull. This was the ultimate pain. If you go back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 18, it's pretty, I don't know if you want to call it poetic. But when Adam and Eve sinned, God gave a curse to the earth. And he said, thorns and thistles will grow up. Well, here, when Jesus is going to be sin for us, he takes the curse and he wears it as his crown. Now, I doubt that the Roman guard were thinking of that when they put it on his head. But I'm sure God did. He wears it as a crown. Then they mocked him. Can you imagine the terror on Judgment Day when those soldiers who mocked him and beat him would now be bowing the knee to him, confessing that Jesus Christ is Lord? That'd be a bad place to be. So then they led him away to be crucified. There were 4 soldiers that would lead him away. One would hold the placard that would say the crime that he committed. In this case, it is Jesus, King of the Jews. Then there would be one on either side of him pushing the crowd away and bystanders so that they could get through. And then the one behind prodding the condemned criminal to the place of death. Verse 21. They forced a certain passerby named Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, who happened to be coming in from the country to carry Jesus' cross. They took Jesus to a place. And I lost my spot. Sorry. They took Jesus to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. A cross had 2 pieces, one horizontal piece where his hands would be nailed, and the one vertical piece where his feet would be nailed. What they would do is once they got to the place, they would nail the hands. They would lift them up with the feet dangling in the air. They would drop the vertical spike of the cross down in the hole, brace it, and then nail the feet in place. as they were going by, Jesus cannot carry his vertical cross. It was about 75 pounds. And there was a man named Simon of Cyrene. And it's interesting, Mark is very specific, oddly specific about who this guy is. Now, we know that anytime you see a name, a date, a place, a number, there's a reason for it. And notice, it doesn't just give Simon, it gives Simon's two sons, Alexander and Rufus. Why was he so specific? I love it, because frequently when you're going through the scriptures, you'll come across names, and it's almost like the writer is giving you the name so that you know who it is. You're like, oh yeah, I met him. The idea was, you can find Simon of Cyrene. He's the dad of Alexander and Rufus. If you don't believe what happened, just go ask him. He'll tell you. He was there. You actually find Acts chapter 13, verse 1. You find this family. And then in Romans chapter 16, verse 13, Paul makes mention of this very man named Rufus. Can you imagine? You're just a Jew coming in for the Passover. You're just coming in to celebrate, and you get stuck in this massive crowd. And then all of a sudden you see this poor beast of a creature that does not even look human, Isaiah said, struggling with a cross, getting beat by the soldiers behind him to continue, and he can't. And then all of a sudden the soldier pulls me out of line and says, you're going to pick this up. Well, I doubt Simon at the time thought anything of it. But can you imagine later, as a believer, having the opportunity to lift up Christ's cross when he needed it the most, when humanly he was not capable of doing it? I don't think he thought of it as an honor then, but I bet later on, man, I was there. His blood was on me. I carried that for him. And he might have told his kids, maybe that's the reason his kids became Christians. He might have told them, if it wasn't for me carrying that cross, Jesus wouldn't have died on the cross. Y'all would be lost. I seriously doubt he said that. But I think honestly he thought back and said, man, I had a part in that. I was selected out of the crowd so that I could carry that for Jesus and know who he is, that I could have him as my Savior too. I helped carry the cross, my part of the cross, for Jesus, so that an entire world could have salvation. Pretty powerful. There's an old hymn that says, must Jesus bear the cross alone, and all the world go free? No, there's a cross for everyone, and there's a cross for me. What does the cross Jesus have you carry today? He says if you want to follow him, guess what you got to do? Take up his cross and follow. What's yours? Maybe it's bearing the load of sin for the sinful world around you as Jesus was. That might just be what it is. Verse 22. They took Jesus to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. This is on the top of Mount Moriah. This is the same place where Abraham offered his son Isaac on the altar. But I do want to dispel what's tradition and what's fact. We have the picture in our minds, or on a hill far away stood an old rugged cross. And we have the image of three crosses up on top of this hill, and this hill looks like a skull. Now, there is a place on top of Moriah that looks like a skull, and I do believe that's where he was crucified, but not on top of it. And I'll give you a few reasons. First of all, it's all stone up there. And so to dig out stone for a few guys getting crucified is a bad idea. Second, and most importantly, the Romans never built crosses, put people on crosses way up off in the distance. They didn't like that. The reason for putting someone in crucifixion was so that you could look at them and say, you know what, if I'm disobedient like that, I'll get the same reward. And so I don't want to do that. I remember a friend of mine, told a story that when he was young, his dad had his razor strap, and he always put the razor strap out, and it was close. It wasn't in the bathroom. It was out in the main part of the house. Easy access. And so my friend always told me that he avoided situations that would enact his father going to get that razor strap. Crosses did the same thing. What the Romans did was they would line the roads with the crosses. And they wouldn't have the people way up high. No, they had them at eye level. So as you walked by, if you wanted to, you could spit on them, you could mock them like they did Jesus. If he's way up on a hill, they can't do that. But if they're right here, you can look at them, you can mock at them, you can spit at them, but you can also remember, if I decide to go against Rome, I'm going to get the same result that they did. It was a tool that was harsh. So before you think it's way up high, no. Jesus got crucified right in your face. And probably the picture of the skull was in the background the whole time he's hanging there. Verse 23, they tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he wouldn't accept it. Then they crucified him. This drink was made to numb the pain. It would make you a little bit delirious. It was actually a type of mercy. But again, Jesus wanted to endure and feel all the pain. He was going to endure every ounce of it so that he would be a high priest that's associated with our weakness. That was tested in all points as we are, yet without sin, Hebrews says. They divided his clothes among themselves, verse 24, by throwing dice to see what each one would get. Verse 20. I did it again. No, I didn't. There it is. Whew. All right, verse 25. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And I've told you before, Pilate wrote that with his own hand, and he did it because in the acrostic, it literally says Yod He Vav He, the unpronounceable name of God, in an acrostic. And he did it just to get after the scribes. But I've mentioned that before, so I didn't go into that tonight. They crucified 2 bandits with him, one on his right and the other on his left. Those who passed by kept insulting him, shaking their heads and saying, "Ha! You were going to destroy the sanctuary and rebuild it in 3 days. Save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the high priests, along with the scribes, were also making fun of him among themselves. They kept saying, "He saved others, but he can't save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now. Seeing is believing." Even the men who were crucified with him kept insulting him. They really didn't understand what they were saying. Because if he was going to save humanity, he couldn't save himself. And if he was going to save himself, he couldn't save humanity. It was in a juxtaposition. But it is an odd place, isn't it? That the scribes and the Pharisees admitted what here? That he saved others. They couldn't deny the fact that he had done great wonders, that he was a wonderful Messiah. They even say it. But they didn't believe it. Verse 33. Oh, sorry, I didn't give you that. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is the only time that Jesus is ever referred to God. Every other time we see it, Jesus mentions God as his Father. But here, in our place, he says, "My God." I'll get there yet. Sorry. I need my little guy down here with me. Verse 35, when some of the people standing there heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." Someone ran and soaked a sponge in some sour wine. Then they put it on a stick and they offered it to Jesus to drink, saying, "Wait, let's see if Elijah comes to take him down." Then Jesus gave out a loud cry and he breathed his last. The curtain in the sanctuary was torn in two from the top to the bottom. It was a massive curtain, interwoven, thicker than the breadth of a man's hand. Impossible for a human to do, but God did it, tearing down the separation between God and man, that we would have now free access. When the centurion, verse 39, who stood standing facing Jesus, saw how he had cried out and breathed his last, he said, "This man certainly was the Son of God." Now there were women watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of young James, or James the Lesser, and Joseph and Salome. They used to accompany him and take care of him while he was in Galilee. Many other women who had come up to Jerusalem with him were there too. Again, he puts them in here. If you don't believe what happened, I've got a few names for you. You can go look them up and you can find them because they're alive today. Jesus here in verse 33 gives a quote. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And for just a little bit, I'd like to take you to the place where you find it. It's in Psalm chapter 22. It's a direct quote. But you literally, if we didn't even have the Gospels, you could take this passage and you could apply it and understand exactly what the Messiah was going to do for us. Because if you read this, it might as well fit right inside the Gospel narrative. Verse 1 of Psalm chapter 22 says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but you do not hear, and in the night season am not silent. But you are holy, enthroned in the praises of Israel. Our fathers trusted in you. They trusted and you delivered them. They cried to you and were delivered. They trusted in you and were not ashamed. But I am a worm and no man, a reproach of men and despised by people. All those who see me, they ridicule me. And that's exactly what was happening. They shoot out the lip. They shake their head. That's literally what Mark said, saying, he trusted in the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. But you are he who took me out of the womb. You made me to trust while on my mother's breast. I was cast upon you from birth. From my mother's womb you have been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near. For there is none to help. Many bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They gape at me with their mouths like raging and roaring lions. I am poured out like water. All of my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It has melted within me. By the way, I have an article written by the New England Journal of Health back in '86 that describes in detail the medical struggle that Jesus had before he died. And if you want it, I can print it off for you. It's perfect. And it kind of leads to what he was saying here. Verse 15, my strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue clings to my jaws. You have brought me to the dust of death. For dogs have surrounded me. The congregation of the wicked has clothed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. Now what's unique about this was written by David 700 years before the Persians had even invented crucifixion. And this is 1,000 years before Christ is to hang on the cross. David had no idea what this truly meant. I can count all my bones. They look and stare at me. They divide my garments among them for my clothing. They cast lots. They literally throw dice. Like I said, you could take this and you could apply it directly to the passage, and there's no difference whatsoever. 1,000 years written in advance. But I want to take you back. I had promised Several of you who were on a Sunday night when we went through Psalm 22, I talked about this one verse and that there's a beautiful picture in it that's obscure and doesn't make much sense. And I wanted to take you to it just a little bit in clothing. Closing. Verse 6. He said, "But I am a worm, and no man, a reproach of men, and despised by the people." The word worm there is actually Tolah. And it's the word that they use in Hebrew for scarlet. It's also translated crimson 38 times in the King James. It's the same word, the crimson or the scarlet. And actually, this worm is where they would get their scarlet dyes in Cermes vermilio. Okay? But here's what's interesting about this worm. Okay? And it starts at number 1, works through number 2, number 3, number 4, okay, in the pictures that you can see there. The first one is that ugly looking little red worm. It's nasty. It looks like a big lice. And that's actually kind of what it is. When it's going to reproduce, it goes up on a piece of bark and it sticks to the bark. Goes through, it sends through the bark and drinks the sap of the wood, whatever the wood might be that it's on. Most of it, it said it was holm oak is where they usually bore. But what they do is they go and they bore themselves so securely that the only way to pull them off this wood is to literally tear their body apart because they're stuck so thoroughly. Now what this worm does is it gives birth to its larva. And the larvae grow up in eggs between the body and the wood. Okay? Now what happens then is the larvae are protected from the outside world, but the mother is not only giving protection for her young, the young actually, while the worm is still alive, they feast on the mother to gain life. So literally the mother dies giving up its life for its children, which sounds really nasty. But here's where it gets really interesting. So we have this worm that's stuck on a piece of wood. It goes to give birth to its children, and the children feast off of the mother to survive. Jesus said, "Take and eat. This is my body that was broken for you." When the mother dies, she secretes this scarlet crimson blood that you see there stains the trees. And in staining the trees, she also stains her children for life until they go and reproduce again and do the same thing over again. 3 days after the blood has dried and the mother is dead, what once was scarlet turns into a white, almost like snow or wool material that flakes and falls down into the ground. Now this happened all over Israel, and like I said, this is what they would do is before it flaked off into white, they would scrape the red, and that's how they made their dyes for their clothing. If you wanted scarlet or purple for the high priest's clothing, they used that method right there. And they're really small, so it must have taken a lot. Or it must have been a very potent crimson. But it's pretty interesting when you apply this to what Isaiah said. Isaiah chapter 1 verse 18 says, "Come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins are like scarlet, they will be white as snow. Though they are like crimson, they shall be as wool." And when you look back, you can see exactly what Isaiah was talking about. Except it wasn't a worm. It was Christ hung on the cross. His blood being poured out for our sins. Landing on top of the altar of the covenant. On the mercy seat. The blood that always speaks before the throne of God, that says that Jesus paid it all. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. It really does mean the world to me that you're getting a blessing out of it. If this video was a blessing, make sure to hit that thumbs up button for me. That way other people can find it as well. Here in the link section, you'll find playlists and new videos that we put out. We try to do 2 or 3 a week. You can also subscribe to the channel by pressing on my face and then hitting the bell icon, and that will alert you to new videos. May God richly bless you.